There is a shadow fact that the Canadian government rarely mentions in their glossy immigration brochures or their quarterly economic updates. While we pride ourselves on being a G7 nation with a stable banking system, the average Canadian household now owes $1.80 for every single dollar they earn after taxes. We are the most indebted nation in the G7, walking on a tightrope made of glass. Meet the Millers, an archetypal Canadian family with a combined income of $160,000. In 2021, they were the envy of their Mississauga neighborhood. They had the detached home, the dual income security, and the glowing promise of the Canadian dream. But beneath the surface of their manicured lawn, a structural rot was setting in. They didn't lose their wealth to a gambling addiction or a stock market crash. They lost it to the very system that claimed to protect them. The silence in their living room today isn't one of peace. It's the heavy, suffocating silence of a life dismantled piece by piece. How does a family earning more than 90% of the population end up with zero? The answer starts with a single decision that felt like a win at the time, but would eventually become their financial executioner. Do you know what your debt-to-income ratio really looks like when the lights go out?
In the spring of 2021, the Bank of Canada's messaging was clear. Interest rates were going to stay low for a long time. The Millers, like hundreds of thousands of other Canadians, took that as a green light. They signed for an $850,000 mortgage on a variable rate, thinking they were being savvy. After all, the spread between fixed and variable was significant, and every expert on YouTube and the evening news suggested that inflation was merely transitory. They felt invincible. They bought a new SUV because their old one was unreliable for the Canadian winters, adding another $800 a month to their overhead. They were living the high-velocity Canadian life, where wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by the size of the monthly payment you can barely afford. They were the middle class, the backbone of the country, completely unaware that they were actually the most vulnerable demographic. They had no idea that Tiff Macklem was about to pull the rug out from under their feet. The curiosity isn't in why they spent the money, it's in why they believed the floor would never move. But as the first whisper of a rate hike hit the wires, the first crack in their foundation appeared. Could you survive if your mortgage jumped by $2,000 overnight? The first rate hike was a sting, but the second, third, and fourth were a systematic dismantling of their disposable income. By mid-2022, the Millers were no longer paying down their principal, they were hitting their trigger rate. For the uninitiated, the trigger rate is the moment your monthly payment only covers the interest, and your debt actually starts growing despite you paying every month. It is the financial equivalent of treading water while someone ties weights to your ankles. The $3,200 mortgage they had budgeted for had ballooned to $5,800. That's $2,600 a month that simply vanished into the coffers of a Big Five bank. To compensate, they did what most Canadians do. They turned to their credit cards. They told themselves it was just for the essentials until things normalized. But in Canada, normal was becoming a luxury that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. They began to feel the visceral pain of the work, sleep, pay, repeat cycle. Every hour worked at their corporate jobs in downtown Toronto was being swallowed by a central bank policy they had no control over. The stress began to manifest physically. Clenched jaws, sleepless nights, and the constant dull ache of knowing that even if they worked 80 hours a week, they were still falling behind. What happens when the bank owns more of your life than you do? While the mortgage was the primary wound, the cost of living in Canada began to salt it daily. Walking into a Loblaws or a Sobeys became a traumatic experience for the Millers. They watched as a single bag of groceries, essentials like milk, eggs, bread, and some chicken breast, started crossing the $100 mark. The Loblaws effect wasn't just a meme on Reddit. It was a hungry ghost eating their remaining cash flow. They started switching to no-name brands. Then they started skipping meals to save time. But the reality was they were saving pennies while losing dollars. They looked at the record profits being reported by grocery giants and felt a boiling resentment that is currently simmering across the entire country. The Canadian identity of being polite and quiet was being tested by the sheer audacity of price gouging during a housing crisis. They tried to garden in their small backyard, but the soil and seeds cost more than the produce they managed to grow. They were trapped in a vertical integration of poverty, where every basic human need, shelter, food, heat, was being taxed or inflated beyond reach.
It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the loss of dignity. Have you ever stood in a grocery aisle and done the math on whether you can afford grapes? This was the new Canadian reality for a family making six figures. Then came the CRA surprise. As a middle-class family, the Millers didn't have access to the offshore accounts or sophisticated tax shelters used by the 1%. They were the perfect targets for the Canada Revenue Agency. In an attempt to make extra cash, Sarah Miller started a small consulting side hustle. She worked late into the night, sacrificing her time with her children to bring in an extra $1,500 a month. But she didn't account for the brutal reality of the Canadian tax brackets. When tax season arrived, the CRA demanded a massive chunk of her extra income, plus penalties for not filing installments. The tax bite didn't just take the money, it took the motivation. They realized that in Canada, the more you struggle to get ahead, the more the system claws back. Their RRSP contributions, which were supposed to be their safety net, were now being eyed as a source of emergency cash. But withdrawing from an RRSP early is a trap. It's taxed as income, and you lose that contribution room forever. They were burning their future to stay warm in the present. The psychological weight of owing the government money while being unable to afford your own roof is a uniquely Canadian nightmare. They felt like they were being punished for trying to survive. Is the CRA the partner you never asked for, taking a cut of your desperation? By the 12-month mark, the SUV they were so proud of became a symbol of their failure. The $800 monthly payment, plus the skyrocketing cost of insurance in the GTA and the carbon tax-inflated price of gasoline, meant the car was costing them nearly $1,400 a month just to sit in the driveway. They tried to sell it, but the used car market had shifted. They were underwater on the loan, owing $45,000 on a vehicle that was now worth $38,000. To sell it, they would have to pay the bank $7,000 they didn't have. This is the debt trap that millions of Canadians are currently stuck in. You can't afford to keep the asset, but you can't afford to sell it either. They were handcuffed to a depreciating piece of metal. Every time Sarah drove to the GO station, she felt a wave of nausea. The car wasn't a vehicle anymore. It was a cage. They started taking on buy now, pay later loans for basic household repairs, compounding their interest problems. The curiosity gap here is terrifying. How many people on your street are driving luxury cars that they are actually paying for with high-interest credit cards? The Millers were the first to admit it, but only to themselves, in the dark, after the kids went to sleep. The facade was still up, but the foundation was gone. In Canada, we are told that the TFSA is the ultimate wealth-building tool. For the Millers, it became a desperate ATM. They had managed to save $30,000 over a decade of disciplined work. In month 14 of their downward spiral, they emptied it. They used the tax-free gains to pay off a high-interest line of credit that had spiraled out of control. It felt like a relief for exactly 3 weeks. Then, a pipe burst in their basement. In the GTA, getting a plumber on short notice is an expensive endeavor. Without their TFSA safety net, they had to put the $4,000 repair on a credit card with a 21% interest rate. This is how the middle class collapses. Not in one giant explosion, but in a series of small, expensive emergencies that occur once your reserves are depleted. They were now living paycheck to paycheck, but with the added burden of $60,000 in consumer debt and a mortgage that was still rising. The emotional pain was now a constant companion. Mark Miller started taking extra shifts, missing his daughter's hockey games, a Canadian rite of passage he could no longer afford anyway. The cost of hockey alone, registration, gear, and travel had hit $3,000 for the season. He had to tell his 10-year-old daughter she couldn't play. That was the day the dream officially died. What is a Canadian winter without hockey? For the Millers, it was the start of the end. Social pressure in Canadian suburbs is a silent killer. The Millers lived in a neighborhood where everyone seemed to be thriving. New decks were being built, Teslas were being delivered, and Amazon packages arrived daily at every doorstep. They felt the visceral need to keep up appearances. They didn't want their neighbors to know they were drowning. They continued to host the annual Canada Day barbecue, putting the Wagyu burgers and craft beer on a credit card they knew they couldn't pay off. This keeping up with the Joneses, or in this case, the Singhs and the Smiths, is a collective delusion. The curiosity gap is that everyone else is likely drowning too, but everyone is waiting for someone else to admit it first.
The Millers were terrified that if they stopped the charade, their property value would somehow drop, or their children would be ostracized. They were spending money they didn't have to impress people they didn't like, to maintain a status that didn't exist. The mental health toll was catastrophic. Mark began experiencing panic attacks on the 401 during his commute. Sarah was secretly researching how to file for consumer proposal on her lunch breaks. They were 2 years into a 24-month collapse, and the final domino was about to fall. Have you ever looked at your neighbor's new renovation and wondered if it was paid for in cash or in desperation? The job market in Canada is often described as resilient, but that's a macroeconomic term that feels like a lie when your company restructures. In month 18, Mark's firm, a mid-sized engineering company in Vaughan, announced they were cutting 15% of their staff due to high borrowing costs and a cooling construction sector. Mark, with his 10 years of seniority, thought he was safe. He wasn't. He was given a severance package that looked decent on paper, 12 weeks of pay, but after the CRA took their cut and the bank took their mortgage payment, it was barely enough to cover 2 months of their new cost of living. In the current Canadian economy, finding a comparable job isn't easy. He was competing with thousands of other laid-off professionals and a massive influx of new graduates and immigrants willing to work for 30% less. The relatable struggle of the Canadian job hunt, the ghosting by recruiters, the 5-round interviews that lead nowhere, the realization that your experience is a liability because you're too expensive, set in. They were now a zero-income household with a $6,000 a month burn rate. The fear was no longer a shadow. It was the roommate that never left. How long could you last if your income stopped today, but your expenses kept marching upward? Desperation leads to dangerous decisions. With Mark unemployed and the mortgage in arrears, they turned to a private lender. In the dark corners of the Canadian real estate market, there is a thriving industry of B lenders and private individuals who lend money at 12 or 15% interest, secured against your home equity. The Millers were told it was a bridge loan, just something to get them through the next 6 months until Mark found work. They took out $100,000, but the fees were predatory. Between the broker fees, the legal fees, and the lender fee, they only saw $88,000 of that money. This is the HELOC nightmare taken to its extreme. They were essentially selling their house to a stranger, one high-interest payment at a time. The curiosity gap here is that many Canadians are using their homes as an ATM, not realizing that when the housing market cools, the bank can call the loan. The GTA market, which had been on a 20-year tear, was finally stagnating. Their equity, the phantom wealth they thought they had, was evaporating as prices dipped by 10%. They were borrowing against a shrinking asset. They were no longer homeowners. They were caretakers for a property that now belonged to the bank and a private lender. The walls were closing in, and the exit signs were flickering out. The psychological breakdown of the Canadian middle class is rarely filmed. For the Millers, it happened over a Tuesday night dinner of boxed macaroni and cheese. A simple question from their son about a school field trip to Ottawa triggered a 2-hour screaming match between Mark and Sarah. It wasn't about the field trip, it was about the crushing weight of their existence. The emotional pain of being a provider who can't provide is a visceral, gut-wrenching experience that many Canadian men are currently facing in silence. Sarah felt the mental load of trying to budget for a household that was mathematically impossible to sustain. They were grieving. They were grieving the life they thought they had earned. They looked at their degrees, their years of hard work, and their good jobs, and they felt betrayed by the Canadian promise. They realized that the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as intended, to transfer wealth from the productive middle class to the asset-owning elite and the banking sector. The resentment they felt toward the system began to turn inward, toward each other. Their marriage, once a partnership, was now a battlefield of blame and what-ifs. Can a relationship survive the total evaporation of financial security in a country that demands so much just to exist? By month 20, the for sale sign finally went up. But it wasn't a strategic move to downsize, it was a forced liquidation. The private lender was threatening power of sale. In Canada, a power of sale is different from a foreclosure. It's faster and more brutal. The lender takes control of the property and sells it to recoup their money, often not caring if there's anything left for the owner. The Millers tried to list it at their 2021 appraisal value of $1.2 million. The market laughed. There were 5 other houses on their street for sale, all of them sitting for 60-plus days. Buyers were scared of the high interest rates, and the stress test meant that many people who wanted the house couldn't qualify for the mortgage. They dropped the price to $1.1 million, then $1 million. Every $10,000 drop felt like a year of their lives being erased. They were watching their hard-earned down payment, money they had saved for a decade, vanish into the ether. The curiosity gap is, what happens to a society when the primary source of wealth for its citizens, housing, becomes a liability? The Millers were about to find out. They were no longer worried about their credit score. They were worried about where they would sleep in 30 days. The sale finally went through at $940,000. After paying off the first mortgage, the predatory private loan, the real estate commissions, which are still obscenely high in Canada despite the market crash, and the legal fees, the Millers walked away with exactly $14,000. 2 years ago, they had $250,000 in equity and $40,000 in savings. Now they had $14,000 and a mountain of remaining credit card debt. This is the total loss scenario. They had to move out in 30 days. The visceral pain of packing up a dream home into cardboard boxes is something you never forget. They had to tell their children they were moving into a 2-bedroom basement suite in a less desirable part of the GTA. The transition from master of the house to basement tenant is an ego-shattering blow that many Canadians are currently navigating. They sold their furniture on Facebook Marketplace for pennies on the dollar. The $3,000 sectional sofa went for $400. The high-end patio set went for $150. They were liquidating their lives just to have enough cash for a first and last month's rent deposit. The Canadian dream had been reduced to what could fit in a 10-by-10 U-Haul. Have you ever had to choose which of your memories to throw in a dumpster because you didn't have the space to keep them? The basement suite was a shock to the system. It was damp, the ceilings were low, and they could hear the footsteps of their landlords, a younger couple who had bought the house using a gifted down payment from their parents. This is the new Canadian class divide, those who have the bank of mom and dad, and those who don't. The Millers didn't. Their parents were also struggling with the cost of living on fixed pensions, their RRSPs depleted by inflation. The relatable life, for many Canadians now, involves multi-generational struggle. Mark was finally able to find work, but it was a contract position with no benefits and a 20% lower salary than his previous role. Sarah was working 2 jobs, one at a retail outlet and her consulting side gig, just to keep the lights on. They were working more hours than ever before, yet their quality of life had plummeted. They were the working poor with white-collar backgrounds. The curiosity gap is how many people you see on the GO train every morning are living in a basement, hiding the fact that they are 1 car repair away from total homelessness. The Millers were now part of that invisible army of the desperate. They were no longer getting ahead, they were just surviving. Is your middle-class life just an illusion held together by a thin thread of credit? The toll on the children was perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the Millers' story. In Canada, we tell our kids that if they study hard and play by the rules, they will be okay. But the Miller children watched their parents follow all the rules and still lose. They saw the stress, heard the late-night arguments about Enbridge bills and Rogers internet costs, and felt the insecurity. The cost of living isn't just a financial metric, it's a childhood thief. They couldn't have friends over because they were embarrassed by the basement suite. They stopped asking for new clothes or toys because they knew the answer was always not this month. This is the visceral pain of a generation of Canadian children growing up with financial PTSD. They are learning that the system is rigged, that hard work is no guarantee of security, and that the dream their parents spoke of was a fairy tale. The curiosity here is what kind of adults these children will become. Will they ever trust the banking system? Will they ever believe in the Canadian promise? The Millers were trying to provide a stable environment. But how do you provide stability when you are living on a month-to-month lease in a city that wants you gone? The family unit was under siege by an economy that valued capital over people. In month 22, the Millers hit another wall. The car they had managed to keep, a smaller, older sedan, needed a new transmission. The quote was $3,500. In their new life, $3,500 was an astronomical sum. Without the car, Mark couldn't get to his contract job in an industrial park that wasn't serviced by public transit. In Canada, if you don't have a car in most suburbs, you can't work. This is the infrastructure trap. They had no more credit, no more savings, and no more assets to sell.
They were forced to take a high-interest payday loan, the very thing they used to look down on. The interest rates on these loans are predatory, often exceeding 40% when all fees are included. They were now in the death spiral of debt. They were borrowing from one lender to pay another, a shell game that only has one ending. The shadow fact here is that payday lending is no longer just for the low-income areas. It is exploding in the middle-class suburbs. The Millers were now the target demographic for companies like Money Mart. They were being harvested for whatever little value they had left. The curiosity gap is, how many people in your office are secretly visiting payday lenders during their lunch break? The shame is what keeps the system hidden, but the pain is universal.
The final blow came not from a bank, but from a health crisis. The stress of the last 2 years finally broke Mark's body. He suffered a stress-induced heart event. While the Canadian healthcare system is free, the hidden costs are devastating. He was unable to work for 6 weeks. His contract position had no paid sick leave. No work meant no pay. The safety net of the Canadian system, EI, employment insurance, is notoriously difficult to access for contract workers and takes weeks to process. The sickness benefit was a fraction of his already reduced income. They couldn't pay the rent on the basement suite. Their landlord, who was also feeling the squeeze of high interest rates on their own mortgage, couldn't afford to be charitable. They were given an N11, an agreement to end the tenancy. The Millers were 24 months into their journey, and they were now facing the very real possibility of a shelter. This is how the disappearing middle class ends, not with a bang, but with a medical emergency and a notice to vacate. The visceral reality of standing in a hospital hallway, worrying more about your rent than your heart rate, is the ultimate indictment of the current Canadian state. How did we get here? And more importantly, how do we get out?
The Millers eventually had to move in with Sarah's sister in a small town 4 hours away from the GTA. They are now hidden homeless, a term for the hundreds of thousands of Canadians living on couches, in basements, or in overcrowded family homes because they can't afford the market rent. Their everything was gone. The house, the cars, the savings, the career trajectory, and the sense of belonging to the middle class had all vanished in 730 days. This wasn't a story of bad luck. It was a story of a system that is no longer designed for the people it claims to serve. The relatable life for the Millers now involves rebuilding from zero at age 45. They are starting over in a country where the cost of entry is higher than ever. The curiosity gap is that the Millers aren't an anomaly. They are a preview. They are the canary in the coal mine for a debt-fueled economy that is running out of steam. If it happened to a family making $160,000, what chance does a family making $60,000 have? The shadow fact is that the middle class isn't just disappearing, it's being liquidated. The question is no longer will the bubble burst, but who will be left standing when the dust settles?
The lesson of the Miller family is a warning to every Canadian. Your equity is not cash. Your income is not security. Your status is a temporary loan from the bank. The visceral pain they experienced was a result of believing in a Canadian dream that had already been sold to the highest bidder. To survive in the new Canada, you have to break the cycle of debt and social signaling. You have to realize that the Bank of Canada, the CRA, and the grocery giants are not your friends. They are participants in a game where you are the fuel. The curiosity gap is, what are you willing to sacrifice now to avoid the Miller's fate later? Are you willing to sell the car? To downsize before you're forced to stop keeping up and start holding out? The Miller's story is a tragedy, but for you, it can be a blueprint for survival. The shadow fact is that the only way to win the current Canadian game is to stop playing by the old rules. We have to redefine what it means to be successful in a country that is increasingly making success impossible for the average person. The first step is admitting that the floor is moving. Are you ready to jump? As we close the chapter on the Miller family, we must look at the bigger picture. Canada is at a crossroads. The middle class, the dream of a stable home, a good education, and a comfortable retirement, is being replaced by a two-tier society of asset owners and lifelong renters. The relatable struggle of the Millers is now the universal struggle of a nation. But there is hope in the truth. By understanding how the Millers lost everything, we can learn how to protect what we have left. It starts with radical financial honesty. It starts with demanding more from our leaders and less from our credit cards.
The curiosity gap remains. Will we wake up and demand a country that values its people over its property prices? Or will we continue to watch as more families like the Millers vanish into the shadows of the new Canada? The choice is ours, but the time is running out. The next 2 years will define the next 20. Make sure you're not the one left with nothing. This is the end of the Miller story, but it's the beginning of a conversation that Canada desperately needs to have. What will you do differently tomorrow? Because the system isn't going to change for you. You have to change for the system. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and above all,